Welcome to our second lesson. The first part of this lesson is about palliative care principles and concepts. The second part presents some self-care strategies for healthcare professionals. This lesson starts with the topic of dynamic involvement of palliative care throughout the illness, introduce the concept of complex symptom assessment, and discuss the importance of patient-family-oriented care management competencies. Moreover, you will learn to comprehend the core challenges and principles in palliative care. Then you are familiarized to the multidimensionality of human being and discuss the complexity of accepting death and non-ideal outcomes. The final part of this lesson will be about willingness to develop oneself as an helper, including developing skills such as self-reflection, communication, and one's own perception of death. First of all, we discuss the dynamic involvement of palliative care throughout the illness. In his book The Greatest Benefit to the Mankind, Roy Porter writes, "The sick man is said to have disappeared from the medical gaze with the birth of the clinic around 1800. Being reduced to a patient, a pathological body studded with lesions. That disappearing act continued during the next 2 centuries, reducing the patient in due course to an X-factor in equations dominated by economics, sociology, diagnostic technology, systems analysis and multitudes of other reference frames." Discussing the relationship between death, medicine and the people, Porter continues. From the 1960s, public disquiet also grew over the depersonalization of death within the hospital. Institutional death was viewed in the medical profession as a case of failure. The modern hospital was dedicated to saving lives, not managing death. Medicine strove to develop high-tech machinery, and the protocols to accompany it. The main aim of treatments being prolongation of life at all costs. From these developments, so Porter, 3 movements resulted. Firstly, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross began with her death awareness movement. Secondly, Dame Cicely Saunders developed an Ars Moriendi model maintaining pain relief through ample dosing with morphine. And thirdly, Dutch Medical Society accepted euthanasia under strictly controlled circumstances in 1984. Today, all these quests are called palliative care. A source of much confusion. Albeit throughout the history of palliative care, its principal quest has been to use medical measures to ease or palliate the symptoms of critically ill and dying people, combined with personalized and respectful caring. Palliative care is often associated with the end-of-life care of people with cancer. In fact, the World Health Organization definition of palliative care talks of patients and their families facing problems associated with life-threatening illness. According to WHO, it is the right of every person with any health-related suffering to receive appropriate palliative care wherever they are. It is the responsibility of every health care professional to practice the palliative care approach. And finally, palliative care is an integral component of good clinical practice, whatever the illness or its stage. Hence, many other disease groups, including people with the neurological disease, should be considered for palliative care. This point of view has been reinforced by the development of guidelines for neurological palliative care and increasing evidence for the effectiveness of introducing palliative care approach. The European Academy of Neurology and the European Association for Palliative Care have developed a consensus document on palliative care for patients with the chronic and progressive neurological disease. Overall, there is limited evidence to support the recommendations, but there is increasing evidence that palliative care and a multidisciplinary approach to care do lead to improved symptoms and quality of life of patients and their families. The main areas in which consensus was found and recommendations could be made are in the early integration of palliative care, involvement of the wider multidisciplinary team, communication with patients and families including advanced care planning, symptom management, end-of-life care, caregiver support and training, and education for all professionals involved in the care of these patients and families. In this relevant document, palliative care is recommended to be integrated early in the care of people with neurological disease. Looking back, during the 21st century palliative care has gained numerous new dimensions, which are far from easing the symptoms of dying people in hospice care. Palliative care units or beds have become standard armament of modern clinics. Advance, care planning or simpler letters to doctors have been widely introduced to avoid aggressive life-prolonging medical measures. Complex symptom assessment is to supersede the one-dimensional pain assessment, and access to palliative care and pain relief has been declared a human right. This figure compares the original idea of a hospice care with the 21st century palliative care. The 21st century palliative care is on a quest to make the sick man, but even more so the sick child and the sick woman, to reappear into the medical gaze, and accordingly, anyone providing healthcare services should be familiar with palliative care philosophy, and be able to provide it on generalist level. This figure demonstrates the palliative care development from 2006 to 2040. The need for palliative care is increasing. The projected rise in deaths from chronic diseases, in addition to increasing overall deaths, and more deaths occurring at older ages, will drive growth in palliative care need that is much greater than previously expected. The dominant illnesses accounting for the growth in palliative care need will be dementia and cancer. It is as yet unclear exactly how health professionals are to meet the increased population palliative care need. If all are to receive palliative care from specialist teams, a massive increase in training of specialist nurses and physicians is needed now. Comorbidities need good symptom-based care. As the number of elderly people is growing, the need for palliative care will increase accordingly. There will be more need for community-based palliative care services as well as good symptom-based care for people with comorbidities. In particularly mental illness, such as depression, anxiety, dementia, among the elderly is expected to increase, which will increase caregiver burden, leading to sleeping problems, anxiety, or even violence. The available evidence indicates that palliative care and a multidisciplinary approach to care lead to improved symptoms and quality of life of patients and their families. The Worldwide Palliative Care Alliance has recommended that all governments integrate palliative care into their country's health system, alongside curative care. At a minimum, palliative care should be provided even when curative care is unavailable. The shift to integrated services has strongly affected the global palliative care policy-making and makes it difficult for governments, service providers and educators to keep up. Integrated palliative care contains a stronger socio-economical side, which cannot be underestimated. Although access to palliative care and pain relief is closely monitored by Human Rights Watch, the majority of governments have been reluctant to invest into high-quality palliative care. A survey published in 2018 revealed that a minority 37% of countries have an operational national policy that includes palliative care. Palliative care is least likely to have funding available compared with other core services. And there is a large country income gradient for palliative care funding, oral morphine availability, and integration of palliative care services at the primary levels of the health system. The WHO survey relating to non-communicable diseases conducted among 194 member states in 2019 indicated that funding for palliative care was available in 68% of countries. Only 40% of countries reported that the services reached at least half of patients in need. Getting governments to invest into palliative care services, research and education is a global challenge. In terms of improving the access to palliative care globally, the United Nations and the World Health Organization have made a statement that providing access to palliative care is an ethical responsibility of health care systems, and that it is the ethical duty of health care professionals to alleviate pain and suffering. Whether physical, psychosocial or spiritual, irrespective of whether the disease or condition can be cured, and that end-of-life care for individuals is among the critical components of palliative care. The Global Atlas of Palliative Care has stated that better, and earlier, integration of palliative care alongside active treatment is needed. Hence, provision of palliative care is not limited to any care setting or certain point during the illness course. It is an integral part of Sustainable Development Goal 3 to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. The Astana Declaration from 2018 adds that promotive, preventive, curative, rehabilitative services and palliative care must be accessible to all. The 67th World Health Association resolution demonstrated that 40 million people are in need of palliative care, but only 14% currently receive it. In particularly, restrictive regulations for morphine impact upon access to adequate pain relief and palliative care. Additionally, lack of training is a major barrier, why people do not gain access to palliative care services. This resolution also indicated that the global need will grow with rising burden of non-communicable diseases and aging populations. Finally, it showed that early palliative care reduces unnecessary hospital admissions and the use of health services, which comes with reduced costs for health expenditures. During the past decade, palliative care has gained considerable attention at the global, regional and national levels, and there has been follow-up on actions outlined in the 2014 World Health Assembly Resolution on Palliative Care. The WHO resolution called countries to action to integrate palliative care into their national health strategies and as part of universal health coverage efforts. Further, important contributions have been made to the evidence-based research and policies on palliative care overall and at the end of life. One of such documents is the Lancet Commission on Global Access to Palliative Care and Pain Relief as well as on Quality Healthcare. Lancet Commission Report 2017 that discussed the issue of an aging population and changing disease patterns across the globe, reported that 25 of 56 million deaths involve serious health-related suffering. This makes 6 billion hours of serious health-related suffering, of which 80% occurs in low and middle-income countries. As a new development, the Quality of Death and Dying Index has been introduced. This index focuses on patients with life-limiting illnesses and their families and aims to produce rankings that take into account the preferences of patients, their caregivers and care providers in terms of what is truly important at end of life. It is combined with country experts' feedback, and will allow for ranking countries in their ability to deliver high-quality end-of-life care. However, such index needs cautious interpretation. For example, the recent evidence demonstrates that the in-country differences can be substantial, hence people in urban areas have much better access to palliative care than those living in remote or rural areas. Equally, caregiver burden must be monitored with great cautiousness as female caregivers disproportionately provide unpaid care services worldwide. We go on to talk about palliative care principles. As palliative care has been evolving during the 21st century from hospice services to palliative care services, a new consensus definition of palliative care was proposed by the International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care in 2019. This definition alleviates that palliative care should be available and accessible to all patients across all ages suffering due to severe illness. According to this definition, palliative care aims to improve the quality of life of patients, their families and their caregivers. Initially, this definition was proposed to replace the WHO palliative care definition from 2002. The lobby work towards this step is ongoing. Even if this definition will not become a new WHO definition, it reflects on issues that have emerged since the WHO definition was agreed on and therefore worth examining carefully. The International Association of Hospice and Palliative Care definition speaks about health-related suffering. How to understand this? Basically, the suffering is health-related when it is associated with illness or injury of any kind. Health-related suffering is serious when it cannot be relieved without professional intervention and when it compromises physical, social, spiritual and/or emotional functioning. This means that palliative care addresses physical, social, spiritual and psychological needs of patients and families, and respectively addresses those multidimensional human needs in care planning and giving. In upcoming lessons you will learn more in detail why these dimensions matter, how to address these, and how to provide symptom control, support and care based on complex needs assessment. Many contemporary palliative care-related documents speak about terminal illness, life-threatening, and life-limiting conditions. Here, the International Association of Hospice and Palliative Care consensus definition promotes the notion of severe illness instead. Accordingly, severe illness is any acute or chronic illness and/or health condition that carries a high risk of mortality, negatively impacts quality of life and daily function, and/or is burdensome in symptoms, treatments, or caregiver stress. The International Association of Hospice and Palliative Care consensus definition lists a number of palliative care principles, which are as follows. Palliative care includes prevention, early identification, comprehensive assessment and management of physical issues, including pain and other distressing symptoms, psychological distress, spiritual distress and social needs. Whenever possible, these interventions must be evidence-based. Furthermore, palliative care provides support to help patients live as fully as possible until death by facilitating effective communication, helping them and their families determine goals of care. Secondly, palliative care is applicable throughout the course of an illness, according to the patient's needs. Is provided in conjunction with disease-modifying therapies whenever needed. May positively influence the course of illness. Intends neither to hasten nor postpone death, affirms life, and recognizes dying as a natural process. Thirdly, palliative care provides support to the family and the caregivers during the patient's illness, and in their own bereavement. Is delivered recognizing and respecting the cultural values and beliefs of the patient and the family. The latter refers to making palliative care accessible, available and culturally accessible, in terms of patient safety, patient or family education, continuous physician-patient-family communication, and respecting patient or family autonomy in decision-making. And finally, palliative care is applicable throughout all health care settings, place of residence and institutions, and in all levels, primary to tertiary, can be provided by professionals with basic palliative care training. Requires specialist palliative care with a multi-professional team for referral of complex cases. These principles support the shift towards introducing integrated and timely palliative care services and advocates that people and their caregivers with health-related suffering may benefit of more comprehensive care at any stage of chronic illness. This shift is aligned with the newest declaration of WHO, stating that palliative care provision is person-centered and thus based on individual needs and symptoms and not limited by prognostics. As a global ambition, palliative care is provided to all of those with chronic and life-limiting conditions. This entails providing support and care for patients, young and old, as well as their informal caregivers. For the latter, palliative care provides a variety of counseling services, support in bereavement and grief management. Let's see now what we know today about multidimensionality of human being. The hospice envisioned by Saunders was to provide food, lodging, personalized care and spiritual succor to patients who were frail, chronically ill, and dying, and could not be taken care at home. Saunders professionalized and medicalized the hospice services. Her ultimate goal was to relieve pain and other distress, so that her patients could live more and suffer less. Until today, addressing and reducing biopsychosocial and spiritual suffering at the end of life has remained the main goal of palliative care. Accordingly, Dame Cecil Saunders developed the holistic philosophy of hospice care. Her model contains of 4 components, each open to independent definition, but inextricably linked to patient and his caregiver's health-related well-being or suffering when ignored. Originally this model was introduced by Cecil Saunders to introduce the concept of total pain. Nowadays this model is used more widely for a complex symptom assessment and control. This model can be seen as a model of different care needs or aspects that may cause distress and illness-related suffering. However, the evidence at hand demonstrates that all these aspects can be integrated into the care provision as individual or collective resources too. Today, the basic theory of palliative care operates with the following model representing the multidimensionality of a human being. Consequently, it is essential to identify key aspects of symptom assessment and management, and to know how to combine the full range of therapeutic care to reduce or eliminate health-related suffering, beginning in the early stages of the disease. Such complex symptom management should be always holistic, not only physical. The awareness of the limitations of any treatment is equally important to the basic understanding of palliative symptom management and control. Palliative care is less treatment-oriented and more care and comfort-oriented. The multidimensional care model oversees and prevents that provided curative measure do not become futile, at the same time providing care and comfort. This means that providing healing is believed to be an essential part of palliative care. In terms of knowledge, the preamble for solid palliative care is a personal maturity combined with the ability to see the big picture. Besides clinical competencies and universal clinical knowledge, a person providing palliative care should have basic education in philosophy, be able to recognize different spiritual traditions and religions, understand the theory and principles of ethics, to be aware of such concepts as human dignity or the multidimensional nature of human being. In fact, healthcare professionals providing that extra layer of palliative care should be able to recognize that for patients and caregivers psychosocial and spiritual aspects are more important than medication. Finally, we will discuss about the challenge of accepting non-ideal outcomes and death as a personal destiny. The famous fiction author Isaac Asimov has written, "Life is pleasant. Death is peaceful. It's the transition that's troublesome." People not being able to consider death, or the transition to death, as their personal destiny is probably as long as the entire human history. The Danse Macabre, from the French language, also called the Dance of Death, is an artistic genre of allegory of the late Middle Ages on the universality of death. No matter one's station in life, the Danse Macabre unites all. Meaning, we all die. In 1973 Ernest Becker published his book The Denial of Death. The premise of The Denial of Death is that human civilization is ultimately an elaborate, symbolic defense mechanism against the knowledge of our mortality, which in turn acts as the emotional and intellectual response to our basic survival mechanism. According to Becker, we are able to transcend the dilemma of mortality through heroism, by focusing our attention mainly on our symbolic selves. This symbolic self-focus takes the form of an individual's immortality project. By successfully living under the terms of the immortality project, people feel they can become heroic and, henceforth, part of something eternal, something that will never die as compared to their physical body. This, in turn, gives people the feeling that their lives have meaning, a purpose, and are significant in the grand scheme of things. Recently a group of researchers, in Journal of Neuroimage, have demonstrated that our brains are designed to shield us from mortal truth. The brain does not accept that death is related to us. We have this primal mechanism that means when the brain gets information that links us to death, something tells us it's not reliable, so we shouldn't believe it. Death is something that only befalls other people. Being shielded from thoughts of our future death could be crucial for us to live in the present. The protection may switch on in early life as our minds develop and we realize death comes to us all. According to the End-of-Life Care Strategy, 4th Annual Report 2012 conducted by Department of Health in United Kingdom. As society we do not talk about death and dying. Most people do not discuss their own preferences for end-of-life care with their partner or family members. Typically people themselves and/or their family members do not know about individuals' preferences in terms of end of life, place of death or prolonged treatments. Talking directly about death and dying results mostly in myriad of metaphors. This is a global phenomenon, which makes implementing palliative care services very difficult. Many physicians and other healthcare professionals explain the lack of palliative care being a cultural thing. Because in our culture we do not talk about end of life and death. In healthcare context and in terms of human rights, culture is a bad excuse. As we do not accept genital mutilations, even if it is culturally justified, why should we accept the serious health-related suffering? It is healthcare professionals' duty to assist patients and their caregivers in decision-making when it comes to advance care planning or going for another treatment, but it is equally important to discuss the preferences related to death and dying. To accept death as a personal destiny as well as medical outcome, and to provide palliative care, takes some personal maturity. Hence, professionals need to learn and embrace that people die, and that dying is mainly a social event with clinical implications. Furthermore, the ability to accept death as a natural process of life should be combined with understanding that a well-managed death is not a failure. In this regard, it is important to understand the disease trajectories, be able to diagnose dying, and provide care for dying, which also includes awareness of what happens when someone has to say goodbye to life based on knowledge regarding grieving and bereavement theories. It is equally important to address the limitations of healthcare structures and the loose connection to social services in many countries. Decentralized planning and delegation of responsibilities contribute to fragmentation, inadequate coordination, and a divide between managing and financing responsibilities makes receiving good care in general difficult for patients and caregivers. Studies indicate that patients and their relatives feel that they have no voice to discuss and decide questions regarding their care and treatment. Elderly suffer from social isolation, little exercise, depression. A platform is missing to simplify communication between patient, caregivers, family doctors, social and health service providers. Multidisciplinary and interprofessional palliative care is to fill this void, which however cannot be done with improving nurses, social workers, therapist involvement in caregiving. According to Professor Scott Murray from Scotland, in aging societies new arts of death dances have emerged. Whereas, cancer trajectory comes with a relatively clear beginning and end. Other old age conditions, such as dementia, frailty and multimorbidity have a prolonged care trajectory. In such conditions people slowly slip away and we can only hope that they are supported by their partner's arms. Also in neurological conditions the deaths are complex and care-intensive. That indicates that the work on improving access to palliative care must be ongoing.